this presentation, we will discuss ethical decision-making. To do so, we will first try and synthesize and answer the so what of mandatory, principle, aspirational, and virtue ethics. Then you'll be provided with some explanation and examples of 6 basic moral principles to guide ethical decision-making. Finally, we'll review one model for ethical decision-making and briefly identify some practical advice for the process. So what's the difference between a mandatory or aspirational ethic or principle or virtue ethic? And how do those terms help us better understand the ethical decision-making process? Let's start by briefly exploring the work of Lawrence Kohlberg and his model of moral development. In this model, Kohlberg is attempting to describe how individuals develop in their moral reasoning. The model has to do with how people make moral decisions that guide their behavior. The 6 stages of Kohlberg's moral development model can be broken down into 3 categories or levels with 2 stages each. For the sake of brevity, we won't go any further than these 3 levels. The first level is called pre-conventional, in which individuals, most often children, make decisions based on the direct and external consequences they experience, such as particular punishments and rewards. Reasoning is focused then on the self and how to increase reward and minimize punishment. The second level is called conventional, and this is a sort of adolescent or slightly more socially oriented version of the pre-conventional stage. Morality is still dictated by an outside force, but this time the outside force is not a parent or authority figure, but rather the rules, norms, and conventions of society. At this level, the concern is about what's best for both self and others. Individuals at the conventional level of moral development might make decisions with reasoning that is focused on what's required for social or group belonging. Developmental psychologists have argued that much of the adult population plateaus at this level of moral development and never develops any further. However, there is a third level in Kohlberg's stage model that's called post-conventional. In this level of moral reasoning, individuals are more aware of the differences between what they believe as individuals and the morals that society holds for them. This level of development is sometimes called the principled level, where a person's own perspective has some room to be at odds with the perspective or rules of society at large. An individual is aware of and thinks through the tensions and conflicts between her or his own moral perspective and that of the larger society. The individual is also aware that the rules and norms of society are not perfect and also changeable. With Kohlberg's model of moral development in mind, think back to the reading from your text where mandatory, aspirational, principle, and virtue ethics were discussed. Essentially, the difference between a mandatory or principle ethic and an aspirational or virtue ethic is that in the first, a counselor is concerned about not getting in trouble, punishment and reward, and in the second, a counselor is concerned first and foremost with what she or he believes is best for the client. They are both important, but notice that the first is most often much more clear-cut and easy to carry out than the second. As you mature in your moral reasoning, life gets more complicated, not less. In counseling, with some important exceptions, not getting in trouble is often fairly simple. On the other hand, when the conversation shifts towards what is best for clients, counselors could debate, and often do, for a long time with no clear answers. All this to say, solid ethical decision-making starts with an attitude of authentic care for clients that goes beyond just abiding by rules or protecting oneself from trouble. Knowing and abiding by the rules is just the start. Making sound ethical decisions involves an appreciation of the complexity of what it really means to keep your client's best interests in mind and the hard work it actually takes to carry this out. Professional codes of ethics identify many of the specific do's and don'ts for professional helpers. However, it's also important, particularly when confronted with an ethical dilemma, to remember that those ethical codes embody 6 basic moral principles that will guide you when the language of the code itself doesn't guide you into specific or concrete courses of action. The first principle is autonomy. The principle of autonomy charges mental health professionals to empower their clients and ensure that client self-determination is preserved. For example, when a counselor provides a document to her or his client that includes the client's rights and responsibilities in the treatment process, the counselor is ensuring that the client understands her or his role. Similarly, when a counselor checks in with a client on a regular basis to ensure the client understands what is happening in counseling, this helps preserve the client's autonomy. The second principle is non-maleficence. This simply means avoid doing harm. An example of this principle in action is if a client invites a therapist to a graduation ceremony. The therapist may perceive that there is some risk of harm to the client by the therapist's attendance at the ceremony because of the unpredictability of client-therapist contact outside the counseling space, and therefore does not attend. On the other hand, the therapist may perceive that not attending would negatively impact the therapeutic relationship, and therefore attends the ceremony. In either case, the therapist's intention is to avoid doing harm. The third principle is beneficence. This refers to mental health professionals doing what they can to promote the well-being of clients and larger society or systems. You might say this principle takes the previous principle, to do no harm, and takes it to the next level. Sometimes, for example, there are 2 courses of action that a counselor has determined will probably not do any harm. Then the question is, which course of action does the most good for my client? You might especially see in this principle that ethical decision-making is not a value-free process. This is again where it's important to be value-aware as a counselor, as well as knowledgeable of your client's values. Knowing your client's values contributes to the first principle. It helps protect their autonomy. The fourth principle is justice. Justice is about knowing what is equitable more than just fair. To help you understand the difference, try using this analogy. Let's say a group of people comes together for dinner, but half of them have had breakfast and lunch where the other half could not, for whatever reason, have breakfast and lunch. And let's say there is a limited amount of food for the group to share for dinner. What might be fair in the simplest terms would be to give every person in the group the same amount of food. But what might be equitable would be giving the individuals who haven't had breakfast and lunch a little more food. Justice, therefore, isn't always as simple as superficial fairness. It requires a depth of knowledge about the bigger picture, the ability to shift your frame of reference, and knowing how to contextualize the experience of another person. The fifth principle, fidelity, is about making realistic commitments and keeping your promises. Counselors do their best, therefore, to assess their own level of competence, skill, energy, and resources so they can gauge their confidence in being able to provide helpful services to individuals given the client's presenting concerns. They are honest with clients about their limitations. Counselors also do their best with the little things like keeping their appointments and returning messages. Veracity, the final and sixth principle, is about honesty and transparency. An experienced therapist might tell you that this gets easier over time. A counselor supervisor I knew said once to me that the more confident he becomes about his abilities as a counselor, the easier it gets for him to say, "I don't know," to clients when he doesn't have an answer for something. Oftentimes it is our insecurity that compels us to try and give an answer when we don't actually have one. Of course, this principle also applies to just plain and simply being truthful with clients and colleagues. With awareness and growth in your own moral development, an attitude of offering the best to your clients, and knowledge of the 6 basic moral principles foundational to the ethical codes, you are well prepared to make tough ethical decisions. To put this into practice, let's briefly review an 8-stage model for making ethical decisions. First, identify the problem or dilemma. For example, is it a conflict in values, a moral issue, or an issue having to do with professionalism? Second, identify potential issues involved. In this step, you can apply each of the 6 moral principles to uncover the primary concerns associated with the dilemma. Third, review relevant codes of ethics. Fourth, know and identify any applicable laws and regulations. Fifth, seek and obtain consultation with a colleague or supervisor. Sixth, consider possible and probable courses of action. 7, enumerate the consequences of various decisions. In other words, identify the pros and cons. And finally, choose what appears to be the best course of action. Now, there are a number of helpful models for making ethical decisions. This is not the only one available to you. The important thing is that you have a process in place, one that you are familiar enough with and prepared to use if you need to. It will not be helpful for you to simply hold out hope that the right response will come in the moment. Additionally, all along the way, remember the following. If at all possible, involve your client. Also, consult with your colleagues. This was already stated, but there's no rule against getting more help. So consult, consult, consult. And finally, make sure you document the consultation and client interactions really well. This reduces your liability and provides clarity about how you handled the situation. In summary, you learned how growing in your own moral development can help you move from a mandatory or principle ethic towards also practicing with an aspirational or virtue ethic. Then you were introduced to the 6 moral principles that are fundamental to all codes of ethics. Finally, you are provided with one decision-making model that will help you apply your growth and learning to an ethical dilemma. I hope this helps you get started as you think about how to strategize and make tough decisions as a helping professional.